Hunter Quatermain's Story by H. Rider Haggard. Sir Henry Curtis, as everybody acquainted with him knows, is one of the most hospitable men on earth. It was in the course of the enjoyment of his hospitality at his place in Yorkshire the other day that I heard the hunting story which I am now about to transcribe. Many of those who read it will no doubt have heard some of the strange rumours that are flying about to the effect that Sir Henry Curtis and his friend Captain Good, R.N., recently found a vast treasure of diamonds out in the heart of Africa, supposed to have been hidden by the Egyptians or King Solomon or some other antique people. I first saw the matter alluded to in a paragraph in one of the society papers the day before I started for Yorkshire to pay my visit to Curtis, and arrived, needless to say, burning with curiosity, for there is something very fascinating to the mind in the idea of hidden treasure. When I reached the hall, I at once asked Curtis about it, and he did not deny the truth of the story. But on my pressing him to tell it, he would not, nor would Captain Good, who was also staying in the house. "You would not believe me if I did," Sir Henry said, with one of the hearty laughs which seemed to come right out of his great lungs. "You must wait till Hunter Quatermain comes. He will arrive here from Africa tonight, and I am not going to say a word about the matter, or Good either, until he turns up. Quatermain was with us all through. He has known about the business for years and years, and if it had not been for him, we should not have been here today. I am going to meet him presently." I could not get a word more out of him, nor could anybody else, though we were all dying of curiosity, especially some of the ladies. I shall never forget how they looked in the drawing-room before dinner, when Captain Good produced a great rough diamond, weighing 50 carats or more, and told them that he had many larger than that. If ever I saw curiosity and envy printed on fair faces, I saw them then. It was just at this moment that the door was opened, and Mr. Allan Quatermain announced, whereupon Good put the diamond into his pocket and sprang at a little man who limped shyly into the room, convoyed by Sir Henry Curtis himself. "Here he is, Good, safe and sound," said Sir Henry gleefully. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to one of the oldest hunters and the very best shot in Africa, who has killed more elephants and lions than any other man alive." Everybody turned and stared politely at the curious-looking little lame man, and though his size was insignificant, he was quite worth staring at. He had short, grizzled hair, which stood about an inch above his head, like the bristles of a brush, gentle brown eyes that seemed to notice everything, and a withered face, tanned to the color of mahogany from exposure to the weather. He spoke, too, when he returned Good's enthusiastic greeting, with a curious little accent which made his speech noticeable. It so happened that I sat next to Mr. Allan Quatermain at dinner, and of course did my best to draw him, but he was not to be drawn. He admitted that he had recently been a long journey into the interior of Africa with Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good, and that they had found treasure, and then politely turned the subject and began to ask me questions about England where he had never been before, that is, since he came to years of discretion. Of course, I did not find this very interesting, and so cast about for some means to bring the conversation round again. Now we were dining in an oak-panelled vestibule, and on the wall opposite to me were fixed 2 gigantic elephant tusks, and under them a pair of buffalo horns, very rough and knotted, showing that they came off an old bull, and having the tip of one horn split and chipped. I noticed that Hunter Quatermain's eyes kept glancing at these trophies, and took an occasion to ask him if he knew anything about them. "I ought to," he answered with a little laugh. "The elephant to which those tusks belonged tore one of our party right in two about 18 months ago, and as for the buffalo horns, they were nearly my death, and were the end of a servant of mine to whom I was much attached. I gave them to Sir Henry when he left Natal some months ago." And Mr. Quatermain sighed, and turned to answer a question from the lady whom he had taken down to dinner, and who, needless to say, was also employed in trying to pump him about the diamonds. Indeed, all round the table there was a simmer of scarcely suppressed excitement, which, when the servants had left the room, could no longer be restrained. "Now, Mr. Quatermain," said the lady next him, "we have been kept in an agony of suspense by Sir Henry and Captain Good, who have persistently refused to tell us a word of this story about the hidden treasure till you came, and we simply can bear it no longer. So please, begin at once." "Yes," said everybody. "Go on, please." Hunter Quatermain glanced round the table apprehensively. He did not seem to appreciate finding himself the object of so much curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said at last, with a shake of his grizzled head, "I am very sorry to disappoint you, but I cannot do it. It is this way. At the request of Sir Henry and Captain Good, I have written down a true and plain account of King Solomon's mines, and how we found them, so you will soon be able to learn all about that wonderful adventure for yourselves. But until then, I will say nothing about it, not from any wish to disappoint your curiosity or to make myself important, but simply because the whole story partakes so much of the marvelous that I am afraid to tell it in a piecemeal, hasty fashion, for fear I should be set down as one of those common fellows of whom there are so many in my profession, who are not ashamed to narrate things they have not seen, and even to tell wonderful stories about wild animals they have never killed. And I think that my companions in adventure, Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good, will bear me out in what I say." "Yes, Quatermain, I think you are quite right," said Sir Henry. "Precisely the same considerations have forced Good and myself to hold our tongues. We did not wish to be bracketed with, well, with other famous travellers." And there was a murmur of disappointment at these announcements. "I believe you're all hoaxing us," said the young lady next Mr. Quatermain, rather sharply. "Believe me," answered the old hunter, with a quaint courtesy and a little bow of his grizzled head, "though I have lived all my life in the wilderness and amongst savages, I have neither the heart nor the want of manners to wish to deceive one so lovely." Whereat the young lady, who was pretty, looked appeased. "This is very dreadful," I broke in. "We ask for bread, and you give us a stone, Mr. Quatermain. The least that you can do is to tell us the story of the tusks opposite and the buffalo horns underneath. We won't let you off with less." "I am but a poor storyteller," put in the old hunter, "but if you will forgive my want of skill, I shall be happy to tell you, not the story of the tusks, for that is part of the history of our journey to King Solomon's mines, but that of the buffalo horns beneath them, which is now 10 years old." "Bravo, Quatermain," said Sir Henry. "We shall all be delighted. Fire away. Fill up your glass first." The little man did as he was bid, took a sip of claret, and began. "About 10 years ago, I was hunting up in the far interior of Africa at a place called Gatgara, not a great way from the Chobe River. I had with me 4 native servants, namely a driver and voorlooper, or leader, who were natives of Matabeleland, a Hottentot named Hans, who had once been the slave of a Transvaal Boer, and a Zulu hunter, who for 5 years had accompanied me upon my trips, and whose name was Mashoon. Now, near Gatgara, I found a fine piece of healthy, park-like country, where the grass was very good, considering the time of year, and here I made a little camp or headquarter settlement, from whence I went expeditions on all sides in search of game, especially elephant. My luck, however, was bad. I got but little ivory. I was therefore very glad when some natives brought me news that a large herd of elephants were feeding in a valley about 30 miles away. At first I thought of trekking down to the valley, wagon and all, but gave up the idea on hearing that it was infested with the deadly tsetse's fly, which is certain death to all animals except men, donkeys, and wild game. So I reluctantly determined to leave the wagon in the charge of the Matabele leader and driver, and to start on a trip into the Thorn country, accompanied only by the Hottentot Hans and Mashune. Accordingly, on the following morning we started, and on the evening of the next day reached the spot where the elephants were reported to be. But here again we were met by ill luck. That the elephants had been there was evident enough, for their spoor was plentiful, and so were other traces of their presence in the shape of mimosa trees torn out of the ground and placed topsy-turvy on their flat crowns, in order to enable the great beasts to feed on their sweet roots. But the elephants themselves were conspicuous by their absence. They had elected to move on. This being so, there was only one thing to do, and that was to move after them, which we did, and a pretty hunt they led us. For a fortnight or more we dodged about after those elephants, coming up with them on 2 occasions, and a splendid herd they were, only, however, to lose them again. At length we came up with them a 3rd time, and I managed to shoot 1 bull, and then they started off again, where it was useless to try and follow them. After this I gave it up in disgust, and we made the best of our way back to the camp, not in the sweetest of tempers, carrying the tusks of the elephant I had shot. It was on the afternoon of the 5th day of our tramp that we reached the little koppie overlooking the spot where the wagon stood, and I confess that I climbed it with a pleasurable sense of homecoming, for his wagon is the hunter's home, as much as his house is that of the civilized person. I reached the top of the koppie and looked in the direction where the friendly white tent of the wagon should be, but there was no wagon, only a black burnt plain stretching away as far as the eye could reach. I rubbed my eyes, looked again, and made out on the spot of the camp, not my wagon, but some charred beams of wood. Half wild with grief and anxiety, followed by Hans and Mashuna, I ran at full speed down the slope of the koppie and across the space of plain below to the spring of water where my camp had been. I was soon there, only to find that my worst suspicions were confirmed. The wagon and all its contents, including my spare guns and ammunition, had been destroyed by a grass fire. Now, before I started, I had left orders with the driver to burn off the grass round the camp in order to guard against accidents of this nature, and here was the reward of my folly, a very proper illustration of the necessity, especially where natives are concerned, of doing a thing oneself if one wants it done at all. Evidently, the lazy rascals had not burnt round the wagon. Most probably, indeed, they had themselves carelessly fired the tall and resinous tambuki grass nearby. The wind had driven the flames onto the wagon tent, and there was quickly an end of the matter. As for the driver and leader, I know not what became of them. Probably fearing my anger, they bolted, taking the oxen with them. I have never seen them from that hour to this. I sat down on the black veldt by the spring and gazed at the charred axles and diesel boom of my wagon, and I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, I felt inclined to weep. As for Mashun and Hans, they cursed away vigorously, one in Zulu and the other in Dutch. Ours was a pretty position. We were nearly 300 miles away from Bamangwato, the capital of Khama's country, which was the nearest spot where we could get any help, and our ammunition, spare guns, clothing, food, and everything else were all totally destroyed. I had just what I stood in, which was a flannel shirt, a pair of veldt schoons, or shoes of raw hide, my 8-bore rifle, and a few cartridges. Hans and Mashun had also each a martini rifle and some cartridges, not many, and it was with this equipment that we had to undertake a journey of 300 miles through a desolate and almost uninhabited region. I can assure you that I have rarely been in a worse position, and I have been in some queer ones. However, these things are the natural incidents of a hunter's life, and the only thing to do was to make the best of them. Accordingly, after passing a comfortless night by the remains of my wagon, we started next morning on our long journey towards civilization. Now, if I were to set to work to tell you all the troubles and incidents of that dreadful journey, I should keep you listening here till midnight. So I will, with your permission, pass on to the particular adventure of which the pair of buffalo horns opposite are the melancholy memento. We had been travelling for about a month, living and getting along as best we could, when one evening we camped some 40 miles from Bamangwato. By this time we were indeed in a melancholy plight, footsore, half-starved and utterly worn out. And in addition, I was suffering from a sharp attack of fever, which half blinded me and made me weak as a babe. Our ammunition, too, was exhausted. I had only one cartridge left for my 8-bore rifle, and Hans and Mashun, who were armed with Martini Henrys, had 3 between them. It was about an hour from sundown when we halted and lit a fire, for luckily we had still a few matches. It was a charming spot to camp, I remember. Just off the game track we were following was a little hollow, fringed about with flat-crowned mimosa trees, and at the bottom of the hollow a spring of clear water welled up out of the earth and formed a pool, round the edges of which grew an abundance of watercresses of an exactly similar kind to those which were handed round the table just now. Now we had no food of any kind left, having that morning devoured the last remains of a little oribe antelope which I had shot 2 days previously. Accordingly, Hans, who was a better shot than Mashuna, took 2 of the 3 remaining Martini cartridges and started out to see if he could not kill a buck for supper. I was too weak to go myself. Meanwhile, Mashun employed himself in dragging together some dead boughs from the mimosa trees to make a sort of skirm, or shelter for us to sleep in, about 40 yards from the edge of the pool of water. We had been greatly troubled with lions in the course of our long tramp, and only on the previous night have very nearly been attacked by them, which made me nervous, especially in my weak state. Just as we had finished the skirm, or rather something which did duty for one, Mashun and I heard a shot apparently fired about a mile away. "Hark to it!" sung out Mashun in Zulu, more, I fancy, by way of keeping his spirits up than for any other reason, for he was a sort of black Mark Tapley and very cheerful under difficulties. Hark to the wonderful sound with which the Mabuna, the Boers, shook our fathers to the ground at the Battle of the Blood River. We are hungry now, my father. Our stomachs are small and withered up like a dried ox's paunch, but they will soon be full of good meat. Hans is a Hottentot and an Umfagozan, that is, a low fellow, but he shoots straight. Ah, he certainly shoots straight. Be of a good heart, my father. There will soon be meat upon the fire, and we shall rise up men. And so he went on talking nonsense till I told him to stop, because he made my head ache with his empty words. Shortly after we heard the shot, the sun sank in his red splendor, and there fell upon earth and sky the great hush of the African wilderness. The lions were not up as yet. They would probably wait for the moon, and the birds and beasts were all at rest. I cannot describe the intensity of the quiet of the night. To me, in my weak state, and fretting as I was over the non-return of the Hottentot Hans, it seemed almost ominous, as though nature were brooding over some tragedy which was being enacted in her sight. It was quiet, quiet as death, and lonely as the grave. "Mashun," I said at last, "where is Hans? My heart is heavy for him." "Nay, my father, I know not. Mayhap he is weary and sleeps, or mayhap he has lost his way." "Mashuna, art thou a boy to talk folly to me?" I answered. "Tell me, in all the years thou hast hunted by my side, didst thou ever know a Hottentot to lose his path, or to sleep upon the way to camp?" "Nay, Macumazahn, that, ladies, is my native name, and means the man who gets up by night, or who's always awake. I know not where he is." But though we talked thus, we neither of us liked to hint at what was in both our minds, namely, that misfortunate had overtaken the poor Hottentot. "Mashun," I said at last, "go down to the water and bring me of those green herbs that grow there. I am hungered and must eat something." "Nay, my father, surely the ghosts are there. They come out of the water at night and sit upon the banks to dry themselves, An Izanusi told it me. Izanusi, witch-finder. Mashuna was, I think, one of the bravest men I ever knew in the daytime, but he had a more than civilized dread of the supernatural. "Must I go myself, thou fool?" I said sternly. "Nay, Macumazahn, if thy heart yearns for strange things like a sick woman, I go, even if the ghosts devour me." And accordingly he went, and soon returned with a large bundle of watercresses, of which I ate greedily. "Art thou not hungry?" I asked the great Zulu presently, as he sat eyeing me eating. "Never was I hungrier, my father." "Then eat," and I pointed to the watercresses. "Nay, Macumazahn, I cannot eat those herbs." "If thou dost not eat, thou wilt starve. Eat, Mashuni." He stared at the watercresses doubtfully for a while, and at last seized a handful and crammed them into his mouth, crying out as he did so, "Oh, why was I born that I should live to feed on green weeds like an ox? Surely if my mother could have known it, she would have killed me when I was born." And so he went on lamenting between each fistful of watercresses till all were finished, when he declared that he was full indeed of stuff, but it lay very cold on his stomach, like snow upon a mountain. At any other time I should have laughed, for it must be admitted he had a ludicrous way of putting things. Zulus do not like green food. Just after Mashun had finished his watercress, we heard the loud woof, woof, of a lion, who was evidently promenading much nearer to our little skirm than was pleasant. Indeed, on looking into the darkness and listening intently, I could hear his snoring breath and catch the light of his great yellow eyes. We shouted loudly, and Mashun threw some sticks on the fire to frighten him, which apparently had the desired effect, for we saw no more of him for a while. Just after we had had this fright from the lion, the moon rose in her fullest splendor, throwing a robe of silver light over all the earth. I have rarely seen a more beautiful moonrise. I remember that sitting in the skirm I could with ease read faint pencil notes in my pocketbook. As soon as the moon was up, game began to trek down to the water just below us. I could, from where I sat, see all sorts of them passing along a little ridge that ran to our right, on their way to the drinking place. Indeed, one buck, a large eland, came within 20 yards of the skirm, and stood at gaze, staring at it suspiciously, his beautiful head and twisted horns standing out clearly against the sky. I had, I recollect, every mind to have a pull at him on the chance of providing ourselves with a good supply of beef, but remembering that we had but 2 cartridges left, and the extreme uncertainty of a shot by moonlight, I at length decided to refrain. The eland presently moved on to the water, and a minute or two afterwards there arose a great sound of splashing, followed by the quick fall of galloping hooves. "What's that, Mashun?" I asked. "That damn lion. Buck smell him," replied the Zulu in English, of which he had a very superficial knowledge. Scarcely were the words out of his mouth before we heard a sort of whine over the other side of the pool, which was instantly answered by a loud coughing roar close to us. "By Jove," I said, "there are 2 of them. They have lost the buck. We must look out they don't catch us." And again we made up the fire and shouted, with the result that the lions moved off. "Mashuna," I said, "do you watch till the moon gets over that tree, when it will be the middle of the night. Then wake me. Watch well now, or the lions will be picking those worthless bones of yours before you are 3 hours older. I must rest a little, or I shall die." "Koos, chief," answered the Zulu. "Sleep, my father, sleep in peace. My eyes shall be open as the stars, and like the stars watch over you." Although I was so weak, I could not at once follow his advice. To begin with, my head ached with fever, and I was torn with anxiety as to the fate of the Hottentot Hans, and, indeed, as to our own fate left with sore feet, empty stomachs, and 2 cartridges to find our way to Bamangwato, 40 miles off. Then the mere sensation of knowing that there are 1 or more hungry lions prowling round you somewhere in the dark is disquieting, however well one may be used to it, and by keeping the attention on the stretch, tends to prevent one from sleeping. In addition to all these troubles, too, I remember, seized with a dreadful longing for a pipe of tobacco, whereas, under the circumstances, I might as well have longed for the moon. At last, however, I fell into an uneasy sleep as full of bad dreams as a prickly pear is of points, one of which I recollect was that I was setting my naked foot upon a cobra which rose upon its tail and hissed my name, Macumazahn, into my ear. Indeed, the cobra hissed with such persistency that at last I roused myself. Macumazahn, Nanzia, Nanzia, there, whispered Mashun's voice into my drowsy ears. Raising myself, I opened my eyes, and I saw Mashun kneeling by my side and pointing towards the water. Following the line of his outstretched hand, my eyes fell upon a sight that made me jump, old hunter as I was even in those days. About 20 paces from the little skerm was a large ant heap, and on the summit of the ant heap, her 4 feet rather close together so as to find standing space, stood the massive form of a big lioness. Her head was towards the skerm, and in the bright moonlight I saw her lower it and lick her paws. Mashune thrust the martini rifle into my hands, whispering that it was loaded. I lifted it and covered the lioness, but found that even in that light I could not make out the foresight of the martini, as it would be madness to fire without doing so, for the result would probably be that I should wound the lioness. If, indeed, I did not miss her altogether, I lowered the rifle, and hastily tearing a fragment of paper from one of the leaves of my pocketbook, which I had been consulting just before I went to sleep, I proceeded to fix it onto the front sight. But all this took a little time, and before the paper was satisfactorily arranged, Mashun again gripped me by the arm and pointed to a dark heap under the shade of a small mimosa tree which grew not more than 10 paces from the skerm. "Well, what is it?" I whispered. "I can see nothing." "It is another lion," he answered. "Nonsense. Thy heart is dead with fear. Thou seest double." And I bent forward over the edge of the surrounding fence and stared at the heap. Even as I said the words, the dark mass rose and stalked out into the moonlight. It was a magnificent, black-maned lion, one of the largest I had ever seen. When he had gone 2 or 3 steps, he caught sight of me, halted, and stood there gazing straight towards us. He was so close that I could see the firelight reflected in his wicked, greenish eyes. "Shoot, shoot," said Mashune. "The devil is coming. He is going to spring." I raised the rifle and got the bit of paper on the foresight straight on to a little path of white hair just where the throat is set into the chest and shoulders. As I did so, the lion glanced back over his shoulder as, according to my experience, a lion nearly always does before he springs. Then he dropped his body a little, and I saw his big paws spread out upon the ground as he put his weight on them to gather purchase. In haste, I pressed the trigger of the martini, and not a moment too soon, for, as I did so, he was in the act of springing. The report of the rifle rang out sharp and clear on the intense silence of the night, and in another second the great brute had landed on his head within 4 feet of us, and rolling over and over towards us, was sending the bushes, which composed our little fence, flying with convulsive strokes of his great paws. We sprang out of the other side of the skerm, and he rolled onto it, and into it, and then right through the fire. Next, he raised himself and sat upon his haunches like a great dog, and began to roar. Heavens, how he roared! I never heard anything like it before or since. He kept filling his lungs with air and then emitting it in the most heart-shaking volumes of sound. Suddenly, in the middle of one of the loudest roars, he rolled over onto his side and lay still, and I knew that he was dead. A lion generally dies upon his side. With a sigh of relief, I looked up towards his mate upon the ant-heap. She was standing there apparently petrified with astonishment, looking over her shoulder and lashing her tail. But to our intense joy, when the dying beast ceased roaring, she turned and, with one enormous bound, vanished into the night. Then we advanced cautiously towards the prostrate brute, Mashun droning an improvised Zulu song as he went, about how Macumazahn, the hunter of hunters, whose eyes are open by night as well as by day, put his hand down the lion's stomach when it came to devour him, and pulled out his heart by the roots, and see, by way of expressing his satisfaction, in his hyperbolical Zulu way, at the turn events had taken. There was no need for caution. The lion was as dead as though he had already been stuffed with straw. The martini bullet had entered within an inch of the white spot I had aimed at and travelled right through him, passing out at the right buttock, near the root of the tail. The martini has wonderful driving power, though the shock it gives to the system is, comparatively speaking, slight, owing to the smallness of the hole it makes. But fortunately, the lion is an easy beast to kill. I passed the rest of that night in a profound slumber, my head reposing upon the deceased lion's flank, a position that had, I thought, a beautiful touch of irony about it, though the smell of his singed hair was disagreeable. When I woke again, the faint primrose lights of dawn were flushing in the eastern sky. For a moment, I could not understand the chill sense of anxiety that lay like a lump of ice at my heart, till the feel and smell of the skin of the dead lion beneath my head recalled the circumstances in which we were placed. I rose and eagerly looked round to see if I could discover any signs of Hans, who, if he had escaped accident, would surely return to us at dawn, but there were none. Then hope grew faint, and I felt that it was not well with the poor fellow. Setting Mashun to build up the fire, I hastily removed the hide from the flank of the lion, which was indeed a splendid beast, and cutting off some lumps of flesh, we toasted and ate them greedily. Lion's flesh, strange as it may seem, is very good eating, and tastes more like veal than anything else. By the time we had finished our much-needed meal, the sun was getting up, and after a drink of water and a wash at the pool, we started to try and find Hans, leaving the dead lion to the tender mercies of the hyenas. Both Mashun and myself were by constant practice pretty good hands at tracking, and we had not much difficulty in following the Hottentot's spoor, faint as it was. We had gone on in this way for half an hour or so, and were perhaps a mile or more from the site of our camping place, when we discovered the spoor of a solitary bull-buffalo mixed up with the spoor of Hans, and were able, from various indications, to make out that he had been tracking the buffalo. At length we reached a little glade in which there grew a stunted old mimosa thorn with a peculiar and overhanging formation of root, under which a porcupine, or an ant-bear, or some such animal, had hollowed out a wide-lipped hole. About 10 or 15 paces from this thorn tree there was a thick patch of bush. "See, Macumazahn, see," said Mashun excitedly as we drew near the thorn. "The buffalo has charged him. Look, here he stood to fire at him. See how firmly he planted his feet upon the earth. There is the mark of his crooked toe. Hans had one bent toe. Look, here the bull came like a boulder down the hill, his hooves turning up the earth like a hoe. Hans had hit him. He bled as he came. There are the blood spots. It is all written down there, my father, there upon the earth." "Yes," I said, "yes, but where is Hans?" Even as I said it, Mashun clutched my arm and pointed to the stunted thorn just by us. "Even now, gentlemen, It makes me feel sick when I think of what I saw. For fixed in a stout fork of the tree, some 8 feet from the ground, was Hans himself, or rather his dead body, evidently tossed there by the furious buffalo. One leg was twisted round the fork, probably in a dying convulsion. In the side, just beneath the ribs, was a great hole, from which the entrails protruded. But this was not all. The other leg hung down to within 5 feet of the ground. The skin and most of the flesh were gone from it. For a moment we stood aghast and gazed at this horrifying sight. Then I understood what had happened. The buffalo, with that devilish cruelty which distinguishes the animal, had, after his enemy was dead, stood underneath his body and licked the flesh off the pendant leg with his file-like tongue. I had heard of such a thing before, but had always treated the stories as hunters' yarns. But I had no doubt about it now. Poor Hans's skeleton foot and ankle were an ample proof. We stood aghast under the tree and stared at this awful sight, when suddenly our cogitations were interrupted in a painful manner. The thick bush about 15 paces off burst asunder with a crashing sound, and uttering a series of ferocious pig-like grunts, the bull-buffalo himself came charging out straight at us. Even as he came, I saw the blood mark on his side, where poor Hans's bullet had struck him, and also, as is often the case with particularly savage buffaloes, that his flanks had recently been terribly torn in an encounter with a lion. On he came, his head well up. A buffalo does not generally lower his head till he does so to strike. Those great black horns, as I look at them before me, gentlemen, I seem to see them come charging at me as I did 10 years ago, silhouetted against the green bush behind. On, on. With a shout, Mashun bolted off sideways towards the bush. I had instinctively lifted my 8-bore, which I had in my hand. It would have been useless to fire at the buffalo's head, for the dense horns must have turned the bullet. But as Mashun bolted, the bull slewed a little, with the momentary idea of following him, and as this gave me a ghost of a chance, I let drive my only cartridge at his shoulder. The bullet struck the shoulder blade and smashed it up, and then travelled on under the skin into his flank. But it did not stop him, though for a second he staggered. Throwing myself onto the ground with the energy of despair, I rolled under the shelter of the projecting root of the thorn, crushing myself as far into the mouth of the ant-bear hole as I could. In a single instant, the buffalo was after me. Kneeling down on his uninjured knee, for one leg, that of which I had broken the shoulder, was swinging helplessly to and fro, he set to work to try and hook me out of the hole with his crooked horn. At first he struck at me furiously, and it was one of the blows against the base of the tree which splintered the tip of the horn in the way that you see. Then he grew more cunning, and pushed his head as far under the root as possible, made long semicircular sweeps at me, grunting furiously, and blowing saliva and hot steamy breath all over me. I was just out of reach of the horn, though every stroke, by widening the hole and making more room for his head, brought it closer to me, but every now and again I received heavy blows in the ribs from his muzzle. Feeling that I was being knocked silly, I made an effort, and seizing his rough tongue, which was hanging from his jaws, I twisted it with all my force. The great brute bellowed with pain and fury, and jerked himself backward so strongly that he dragged me some inches further from the mouth of the hole, and again made a sweep at me, catching me this time round the shoulder joint in the hook of his horn. I felt that it was all up now, and began to holloa. "He has got me!" I shouted in mortal terror. "Gwasa, Mashune, Gwasa! Stab, Mashun, stab!" One hoist of the great head, and out of the hole I came like a periwinkle out of his shell. But even as I did so, I caught sight of Mashun's stalwart form advancing with his bangwan, or broad stabbing assegai, raised above his head. In another quarter of a second I had fallen from the horn, and heard the blow of the spear, followed by the indescribable sound of steel shearing its way through flesh. I had fallen on my back, and looking up, I saw that the gallant Mashun, had driven the assegai a foot or more into the carcass of the buffalo and was turning to fly. Alas, it was too late. Bellowing madly and spouting blood from mouth and nostrils, the devilish brute was on him, and had thrown him up like a feather, and then gored him twice as he lay. I struggled up with some wild idea of affording help, but before I had gone a step, the buffalo gave one long, sighing bellow, and rolled over dead by the side of his victim. Mashune was still living, but a single glance at him told me that his hour had come. The buffalo's horn had driven a great hole in his right lung and inflicted other injuries. I knelt down beside him in the uttermost distress and took his hand. "Is he dead, Macumazahn?" he whispered. "My eyes are blind. I cannot see." "Yes, he is dead." "Did the black devil hurt thee, Macumazahn?" "No, my poor fellow, I am not much hurt." "Ow, I am glad." Then came a long silence, broken only by the sound of the air whistling through the hole in his lung as he breathed. "Macumazahn, art thou there? I cannot feel thee." "I am here, Mashuna." "I die, Macumazahn. The world flies round and round." I go out into the dark. Surely, my father, at times in days to come, thou wilt think of Mashun, who stood by thy side, when thou killest elephants as we used. They were his last words. His brave spirit passed with him. I dragged his body to the hole under the tree and pushed it in, placing his broad assegai by him, according to the custom of his people, that he might not go defenseless on his long journey. And then, ladies, I am not ashamed to confess, I stood alone there before it and wept like a woman. Long Odds, a short story by H. Rider Haggard. The story, which is narrated in the following pages, came to me from the lips of my old friend Allan Quatermain, or Hunter Quatermain, as we used to call him in South Africa. He told it to me one evening when I was stopping with him at the place he bought in Yorkshire. Shortly after that, the death of his only son so unsettled him that he immediately left England, accompanied by two companions, his old fellow voyagers, Sir Henry Curtis and Captain Good, and has now utterly vanished into the dark heart of Africa. He is persuaded that a white people, of which he has heard rumours all his life, exists somewhere on the highlands in the vast, still unexplored interior, and his great ambition is to find them before he dies. This is the wild quest upon which he and his companions have departed, and from which I shrewdly suspect they never will return. One letter only have I received from the old gentleman, dated from a mission station high up the Tana, a river on the east coast, about 300 miles north of Zanzibar. In it, he says that they have gone through many hardships and adventures, but are alive and well, and have found traces which go far towards making him hope that the results of their wild quest may be a magnificent and unexampled discovery. I greatly fear, however, that all he has discovered is death, for this letter came a long while ago, and nobody has heard a single word of the party since. They have totally vanished. It was on the last evening of my stay at his house that he told the ensuing story to me and Captain Good, who was dining with him. He had eaten his dinner and drunk 2 or 3 glasses of old port, just to help Good and myself to the end of the second bottle. It was an unusual thing for him to do, for he was a most abstemious man, having conceived, as he used to say, a great horror of drink from observing its effects upon the class of colonists, hunters, transport riders, and others, amongst whom he had passed so many years of his life. Consequently, the good wine took more effect on him than it would have done on most men, sending a little flush into his wrinkled cheeks and making him talk more freely than usual. Dear old man, I can see him now, as he went limping up and down the vestibule, with his grey hair sticking up in scrubbing brush fashion, his shriveled yellow face, and his large dark eyes that were as keen as any hawk's and yet soft as a buck's. The whole room was hung with trophies of his numerous hunting expeditions, and he had some story about every one of them, if only he could be got to tell it. Generally he would not, for he was not very fond of narrating his own adventures, but tonight the port wine made him more communicative. "Ah, you brute," he said, stopping beneath an unusually large skull of a lion, which was fixed just over the mantelpiece beneath a long row of guns, its jaws distended to their utmost width. "Ah, you brute, you have given me a lot of trouble for the last dozen years, and will, I suppose, to my dying day." "Tell us the yarn, Quatermain," said Good. "You have often promised to tell me, and you never have." "You had better not ask me to," he answered, "for it is a longish one." "All right," I said. "The evening is young, and there is some more port." Thus adjured, he filled his pipe from a jar of coarse-cut Boer tobacco that was always standing on the mantelpiece, and still walking up and down the room, began. "It was, I think, in the March of '69 that I was up in Sekukuni's country. It was just after old Sequati's time, and Sekukuni had got into power. I forget how. Anyway, I was there. I had heard that the Bapedi people had brought down an enormous quantity of ivory from the interior, and so I started with a wagon load of goods and came straight away from Middelburg to try and trade some of it. It was a risky thing to go into the country so early on account of the fever, but I knew that there were one or two others after that lot of ivory, so I determined to have a try for it and take my chance of fever. I had become so tough from continual knocking about that I did not set it down at much. Well, I got on all right for a while. It is a wonderfully beautiful piece of bush veldt, with great ranges of mountains running through it, and round granite koppies starting up here and there, looking out like sentinels over the rolling waste of bush. But it is very hot, hot as a stewpan, and when I was there that March, which of course is autumn in this part of Africa, the whole place reeked of fever. Every morning, as I trekked along down by the Oliphant River, I used to creep from the wagon at dawn and look out. But there was no river to be seen, only a long line of billows of what looked like the finest cotton wool tossed up lightly with a pitchfork. It was the fever mist. Out from among the scrub, too, came little spirals of vapour, as though there were hundreds of tiny fires alight in it, reek rising from thousands of tons of rotting vegetation. It was a beautiful place, but the beauty was the beauty of death. And all those lines and blots of vapour wrote one great word across the surface of the country, and that word was fever. It was a dreadful year of illness, that. I came, I remember, to one little kraal of knobnoses and went up to it to see if I could get some maas, or curdled buttermilk, and a few mealies. As I drew near, I was struck with the silence of the place. No children began to chatter, and no dogs barked, nor could I see any native sheep or cattle. The place, though it had evidently been inhabited of late, was as still as the bush round it, and some guinea fowl got up out of the prickly pear bushes right at the kraal gate. I remember that I hesitated a little before going in. There was such an air of desolation about the spot. Nature never looks desolate when man has not yet laid his hand upon her breast. She is only lonely. But when man has been and has passed away, then she looks desolate. Well, I passed into the kraal and went up to the principal hut. In front of the hut was something with an old sheepskin kaross thrown over it. I stooped down and drew off the rug, and then shrank back amazed, for under it was the body of a young woman recently dead. For a moment I thought of turning back, but my curiosity overcame me. So going past the dead woman, I went down on my hands and knees and crept into the hut. It was so dark that I could not see anything, though I could smell a great deal, so I lit a match. It was a tan-sticker match, and burnt slowly and dimly. and as the light gradually increased, I made out what I took to be a family of people, men, women, and children, fast asleep. Presently it burnt up brightly, and I saw that they too, 5 of them altogether, were quite dead. One was a baby. I dropped the match in a hurry and was making my way from the hut as quick as I could go when I caught sight of 2 bright eyes staring out of a corner. Thinking it was a wild cat or some such animal, I redoubled my haste, when suddenly a voice near the eyes began first to mutter and then to send up a succession of awful yells. Hastily I lit another match and perceived that the eyes belonged to an old woman wrapped up in a greasy leather garment. Taking her by the arm, I dragged her out, for she could not or would not come by herself, and the stench was overpowering me. Such a sight as she was, a bag of bones covered over with black shriveled parchment. The only white thing about her was her wool, and she seemed to be pretty well dead, except for her eyes and her voice. She thought that I was a devil come to take her, and that is why she yelled so. Well, I got her down to the wagon and gave her a tot of Cape smoke, and then, as soon as it was ready, poured about a pint of beef tea down her throat, made from the flesh of a blue wildebeest I had killed the day before, and after that she brightened up wonderfully. She could talk Zulu. Indeed, it turned out that she had run away from Zululand in T'Chaka's time, and she told me that all the people whom I had seen had died of fever. When they had died, the other inhabitants of the kraal had taken the cattle and gone away, leaving the poor old woman, who was helpless from age and infirmity, to perish of starvation or disease, as the case might be. She had been sitting there for 3 days among the bodies when I found her. I took her on to the next kraal and gave the headman a blanket to look after her, promising him another if I found her well when I came back. I remember that he was much astonished at my parting with 2 blankets for the sake of such a worthless old creature. "Why did I not leave her in the bush?" he asked. "Those people carry the doctrine of the survival of the fittest to its extreme, you see." It was the night after I had got rid of the old woman that I made my first acquaintance with my friend yonder, and he nodded towards the skull that seemed to be grinning down at us in the shadow of the wide mantel-shelf. I had trekked from dawn till 11 o'clock, a long trek, but I wanted to get on, and had turned the oxen out to graze, sending the voorlooper to look after them, my intention being to inspan again about 6 o'clock and trek with the moon till 10. Then I got into the wagon and had a good sleep till 2:30 or so in the afternoon, when I rose and cooked some meat and had my dinner, washing it down with a pannikin of black coffee, for it was difficult to get preserved milk in those days. Just as I had finished, and the driver, a man called Tom, was washing up the things, in comes the young scoundrel of a voorlooper driving 1 ox before him. "Where are the other oxen?" I asked. "Koos," he said. "Koos! The other oxen have gone away." I turned my back for a minute, and when I looked round again, they were all gone, except Captain here, who was rubbing his back against a tree. "You mean that you have been asleep, and let them stray, you villain? I will rub your back against a stick," I answered, feeling very angry, for it was not a pleasant prospect to be stuck up in that fever trap for a week or so while we were hunting for the oxen. "Off you go, and you too, Tom, and mind you don't come back till you have found them. They have trekked back along the Middelburg Road and are a dozen miles off by now, I'll be bound. Now, no words. Go both of you." Tom, the driver, swore and caught the lad a hearty kick, which he richly deserved, and then, having tied old Captain up to the disselboom with a rame, they took their assegai and sticks and started. I would have gone too, only I knew that somebody must look after the wagon, and I did not like to leave either of the boys with it at night. I was in a very bad temper indeed, although I was pretty well used to these sort of occurrences, and soothed myself by taking a rifle and going to kill something. For a couple of hours I poked about without seeing anything that I could get a shot at, but at last, just as I was again within 70 yards of the wagon, I put up an old impala ram, from behind a mimosa thorn. He ran straight for the wagon, and it was not till he was passing within a few feet of it that I could get a decent shot at him. Then I pulled and caught him halfway down the spine. Over he went, dead as a doornail, and a pretty shot it was, though I ought not to say it. This little incident put me into rather a better humour, especially as the buck had rolled right against the after part of the wagon, so I had only to gut him, fix a rein round his legs, and haul him up. By the time I had done this, the sun was down, and the full moon was up, and a beautiful moon it was. And then there came that wonderful hush which sometimes falls over the African bush in the early hours of the night. No beast was moving, and no bird called. Not a breath of air stirred the quiet trees, and the shadows did not even quiver, they only grew. It was very oppressive and very lonely, for there was not a sign of the cattle or the boys. I was quite thankful for the society of old Quatermain, who was lying down contentedly against the disselboom, chewing the cud with a good conscience. Presently, however, Quatermain began to get restless. First he snorted, then he got up and snorted again. I couldn't make it out, so like a fool I got down off the wagon box to have a look round, thinking it might be the lost oxen coming. Next instant I regretted it, for all of a sudden I heard a roar and saw something yellow flash past me and light on poor Quatermain. Then came a bellow of agony from the ox, and a crunch as the lion put his teeth through the poor brute's neck, and I began to understand what had happened. My rifle was in the wagon, and my first thought being to get hold of it, I turned and made a bolt for the box. I got my foot up on the wheel and flung my body forward onto the wagon, and there I stopped as if I were frozen, and no wonder, for as I was about to spring up, I heard the lion behind me, and next second I felt the brute, aye, as plainly as I can feel this table. I felt him, I say, sniffing at my left leg that was hanging down. My word, I did feel queer. I don't think that I ever felt so queer before. I dared not move for the life of me, and the odd thing was that I seemed to lose power over my leg, which developed an insane sort of inclination to kick out of its own mere motion, just as hysterical people want to laugh when they ought to be particularly solemn. Well, the lion sniffed and sniffed, beginning at my ankle and slowly nosing away up to my thigh. I thought that he was going to get hold then, but he did not. He only growled softly and went back to the ox. Shifting my head a little, I got a full view of him. He was about the biggest lion I ever saw, and I have seen a great many, and he had a most tremendous black mane. What his teeth were like you can see. Look, they're pretty big ones, ain't they? Altogether, he was a magnificent animal, and as I lay sprawling on the foretongue of the wagon, it occurred to me that he would look uncommonly well in a cage. He stood there by the carcass of poor Quatermain and deliberately disemboweled him as neatly as a butcher could have done. All this while I dared not move, for he kept lifting his head and keeping an eye on me as he licked his bloody chops. When he had cleaned Quatermain out, he opened his mouth and roared, and I am not exaggerating when I say that the sound shook the wagon. Instantly there came back an answering roar. Heavens, I thought, there is his mate. Hardly was the thought out of my head when I caught sight in the moonlight of the lioness bounding along through the long grass, and after her a couple of cubs about the size of mastiffs. She stopped within a few feet of my head and stood, waved her tail, and fixed me with her glowing yellow eyes. But just as I thought that it was all over, she turned and began to feed on Quatermain, and so did the cubs. There were the four of them within 8 feet of me, growling and quarrelling, rending and tearing, and crunching poor Quatermain's bones, and there I lay shaking with terror, and the cold perspiration pouring out of me, feeling like another Daniel come to judgment in a new sense of the phrase. Presently the cubs had eaten their fill and began to get restless. One went round to the back of the wagon and pulled at the impala buck that hung there, and the other came round my way and commenced the sniffing game at my leg. Indeed, he did more than that, for my trouser being hitched up a little, he began to lick the bare skin with his rough tongue. The more he licked, the more he liked it, to judge from his increased vigour and the loud purring noise he made. Then I knew that the end had come, for in another second his file-like tongue would have rasped through the skin of my leg, which was luckily pretty tough, and have drawn the blood, and then there would be no chance for me. So I just lay there and thought of my sins, and prayed to the Almighty, and reflected that after all life was a very enjoyable thing. Then of a sudden I heard a crashing of bushes and the shouting and whistling of men, and there were the two boys coming back with the cattle, which they had found trekking along all together. The lions lifted their heads and listened, then bounded off without a sound, and I fainted. The lions came back no more that night, and by the next morning my nerves had got pretty straight again, but I was full of wrath when I thought of all that I had gone through at the hands, or rather noses, of those 4 brutes, and of the fate of my after-ox captain. He was a splendid ox, and I was very fond of him. So wroth was I that like a fool I determined to attack the whole family of them. It was worthy of a greenhorn out on his first hunting trip, but I did it nevertheless. Accordingly, after breakfast, having rubbed some oil upon my leg, which was very sore from the cub's tongue, I took the driver, Tom, who did not half like the business, and having armed myself with an ordinary double No. 12 smoothbore, the first breech-loader I ever had, I started. I took the smoothbore because it shot a bullet very well, and my experience has been that a round ball from a smoothbore is quite as effective against a lion as an express bullet. The lion is soft and not a difficult animal to finish if you hit him anywhere in the body. A buck takes far more killing. Well, I started, and the first thing I set to work to do was to try to discover whereabouts the brutes lay up for the day. About 300 yards from the wagon was the crest of a rise covered with single mimosa trees, dotted about in a park-like fashion, and beyond this lay a stretch of open plain running down to a dry pan, or water-hole, which covered about an acre of ground, and was densely clothed with reeds, now in the sere and yellow leaf. From the further edge of this pan, the ground sloped up again to a great cleft, or nullah, which had been cut out by the action of the water, and was pretty thickly sprinkled with bush, amongst which grew some large trees, I forget of what sort. It at once struck me that the dry pan would be a likely place to find my friends in, as there is nothing a lion is fonder of than lying up in reeds, through which he can see things without being seen himself. Accordingly, thither I went and prospected. Before I had got halfway round the pan, I found the remains of a blue wildebeest that had evidently been killed within the last 3 or 4 days and partially devoured by lions. And from other indications about, I was soon assured that if the family were not in the pan that day, they spent a good deal of their spare time there. But if there, the question was how to get them out, for it was clearly impossible to think of going in after them, unless one was quite determined to commit suicide. Now there was a strong wind blowing from the direction of the wagon, across the reedy pan, towards the bush-clad kloof or donga, and this first gave me the idea of firing the reeds, which, as I think I told you, were pretty dry. Accordingly, Tom took some matches and began starting little fires to the left, and I did the same to the right. But the reeds were still green at the bottom, and we should never have got them well alight had it not been for the wind, which grew stronger and stronger as the sun climbed higher and forced the fire into them. At last, after half an hour's trouble, the flames got a hold and began to spread out like a fan, whereupon I went round to the further side of the pan to wait for the lions, standing well out in the open, as we stood at the copse today where you shot the woodcock. It was a rather risky thing to do, but I used to be so sure of my shooting in those days that I did not so much mind the risk, Scarcely had I got round when I heard the reeds parting before the onward rush of some animal. "Now for it," said I. On it came. I could see that it was yellow and prepared for action, when instead of a lion out, bounded a beautiful reetbok, which had been lying in the shelter of the pan. It must, by the way, have been a reetbok of a peculiarly confiding nature to lay itself down with the lion, like the lamb of prophecy, but I suppose the reeds were thick, and that it kept a long way off. Well, I let the reetbok go, and it went like the wind, and kept my eyes fixed upon the reeds. The fire was burning like a furnace now, the flames crackling and roaring as they bit into the reeds, sending spouts of fire 20 feet and more into the air, and making the hot air dance above in a way that was perfectly dazzling. But the reeds were still half green, and created an enormous quantity of smoke, which came rolling towards me like a curtain, lying very low on account of the wind. Presently, above the crackling of the fire, I heard a startled roar, then another and another. So the lions were at home. I was beginning to get excited now, for, as you fellows know, there is nothing in experience to warm up your nerves like a lion at close quarters, unless it is a wounded buffalo, and I became still more so when I made out through the smoke that the lions were all moving about on the extreme edge of the reeds. Occasionally they would pop their heads out like rabbits from a burrow, and then, catching sight of me standing about 50 yards away, draw them back again. I knew that it must be getting pretty warm behind them, and that they could not keep the game up for long. And I was not mistaken, for suddenly all 4 of them broke cover together, the old black-maned lion leading by a few yards. I never saw a more splendid sight in all my hunting experience than those 4 lions bounding across the veldt, overshadowed by the dense pall of smoke and backed by the fiery furnace of the burning reeds. I reckoned that they would pass on their way to the bushy kloof within about 25 yards of me, so taking a long breath, I got my gun well onto the lion's shoulder, the black-maned one, so as to allow for an inch or two of motion and catch him through the heart. I was on, dead on, and my finger was just beginning to tighten on the trigger when suddenly I went blind. A bit of reed ash had drifted into my right eye. I danced and rubbed and succeeded in clearing it more or less, just in time to see the tail of the last lion vanishing round the bushes up the kloof. If ever a man was mad, I was that man. It was too bad, and such a shot in the open. However, I was not going to be beaten, so I just turned and marched for the kloof. Tom, the driver, begged and implored me not to go, but though as a general rule I never pretend to be very brave, which I am not, I was determined that I would either kill those lions or they should kill me. So I told Tom that he need not come unless he liked. But I was going, and being a plucky fellow, a Swazi by birth, he shrugged his shoulders, muttered that I was mad or bewitched, and followed doggedly in my tracks. We soon reached the kloof, which was about 300 yards in length and but sparsely wooded, and then the real fun began. There might be a lion behind every bush. There certainly were 4 lions somewhere. The delicate question was, where? I peeped and poked and looked in every possible direction, with my heart in my mouth, and was at last rewarded by catching a glimpse of something yellow moving behind a bush. At the same moment, from another bush opposite me, out burst one of the cubs and galloped back towards the burnt pan. I whipped round and let drive a snapshot that tipped him head over heels, breaking his back within 2 inches of the root of the tail, and there he lay helpless but glaring. Tom afterwards killed him with his assegai. I opened the breech of the gun and hurriedly pulled out the old case, which, to judge from what ensued, must, I suppose, have burst and left a portion of its fabric sticking to the barrel. At any rate, when I tried to get in the new cartridge, it would only enter halfway. And, would you believe it? This was the moment that the lioness, attracted no doubt by the outcry of her cub, chose to put in an appearance. There she stood, 20 paces or so from me, lashing her tail and looking just as wicked as it is possible to conceive. Slowly I stepped backwards, trying to push in the new case, and as I did so, she moved on in little runs, dropping down after each run. The danger was imminent, and the case would not go in. At the moment, I oddly enough thought of the cartridge maker, whose name I will not mention, and earnestly hoped that if the lion got me some condign punishment, would overtake him. It would not go in, so I tried to pull it out. It would not come out either, and my gun was useless if I could not shut it to use the other barrel. I might as well have had no gun. Meanwhile, I was walking backward, keeping my eye on the lioness, who was creeping forward on her belly without a sound, but lashing her tail and keeping her eye on me. And in it, I saw that she was coming in a few seconds more. I dashed my wrist and the palm of my hand against the brass rim of the cartridge till the blood poured from them. Look, there are the scars of it to this day. Here Quatermain held up his right hand to the light and showed us 4 or 5 white cicatrices just where the wrist is set into the hand. But it was not of the slightest use, he went on. The cartridge would not move. I only hope that no other man will ever be put in such an awful position. The lioness gathered herself together, and I gave myself up for lost, when suddenly Tom shouted out from somewhere in my rear, "You are walking onto the wounded cub. Turn to the right." I had the sense, dazed as I was, to take the hint and slewing round at right angles, but still keeping my eyes on the lioness, I continued my backward walk. To my intense relief, with a low growl, she straightened herself, turned, and bounded further up the kloof. "Come on, Macumazahn," said Tom. "Let's get back to the wagon." "All right, Tom," I answered. "I will when I have killed those 3 other lions." For by this time I was bent on shooting them, as I never remember being bent on anything before or since. "You can go if you like, or you can get up a tree." He considered the position a little, and then he very wisely got up a tree. I wish that I had done the same. Meanwhile, I had found my knife, which had an extractor in it, and succeeded after some difficulty in pulling out the cartridge which had so nearly been the cause of my death, and removing the obstruction in the barrel. It was very little thicker than a postage stamp, certainly not thicker than a piece of writing paper. This done, I loaded the gun, bound a handkerchief round my wrist and hand to staunch the flowing of the blood, and started on again. I had noticed that the lioness went into a thick green bush, or rather cluster of bushes, growing near the water, about 50 yards higher up, for there was a little stream running down the kloof, and I walked towards this bush. When I got there, however, I could see nothing, so I took up a big stone and threw it into the bushes. I believe that it hit the other cub, for out it came with a rush, giving me a broadside shot, of which I promptly availed myself, knocking it over dead. Out, too, came the lioness like a flash of light, but quick as she went, I managed to put the other bullet into her ribs, so that she rolled right over 3 times, like a shot rabbit. I instantly got 2 more cartridges into the gun, and as I did so, the lioness rose again and came crawling towards me on her forepaws, roaring and groaning, and with such an expression of diabolical fury on her countenance as I have not often seen. I shot her again through the chest, and she fell over onto her side, quite dead. That was the first and last time that I ever killed a brace of lions right and left, and what is more, I never heard of anybody else doing it. Naturally, I was considerably pleased with myself, and having again loaded up, I went on to look for the black-maned beauty who had killed Captain. Slowly, and with the greatest care, I proceeded up the kloof, searching every bush and tuft of grass as I went. It was wonderfully exciting work, for I never was sure from one moment to another but that he would be on me. I took comfort, however, from the reflection that a lion rarely attacks a man. Rarely, I say. Sometimes he does, as you will see, unless he is cornered or wounded. I must have been nearly an hour hunting after that lion. Once I thought I saw something move in a clump of tambuki grass, but I could not be sure, and when I trod out the grass, I could not find him. At last I worked up to the head of the kloof, which made a cul-de-sac. It was formed of a wall of rock about 50 feet high. Down this rock trickled a little waterfall, and in front of it, some 70 feet from its face, rose a great piled-up mass of boulders, in the crevices, and on the top of which grew ferns, grasses, and stunted bushes. This mass was about 25 feet high. The sides of the kloof here were also very steep. Well, I came to the top of the nullah and looked all round. No signs of the lion. Evidently, I had either overlooked him further down or he had escaped right away. It was very vexatious. But still, 3 lions were not a bad bag for 1 gun before dinner, and I was fain to be content. Accordingly, I departed back again, making my way round the isolated pillar of boulders, beginning to feel, as I did so, that I was pretty well done up with excitement and fatigue, and should be more so before I had skinned those 3 lions. When I had got, as nearly as I could judge, about 18 yards past the pillar or mass of boulders, I turned to have another look round. I have a pretty sharp eye, but I could see nothing at all. Then, on a sudden, I saw something sufficiently alarming. On the top of the mass of boulders, opposite to me, standing out clear against the rock beyond, was the huge black-maned lion. He had been crouching there, and now arose as though by magic. There he stood lashing his tail, just like a living reproduction of the animal on the gateway of Northumberland House that I have seen in a picture. But he did not stand long. Before I could fire, before I could do more than get the gun to my shoulder, he sprang straight up and out from the rock, and driven by the impetus of that one mighty bound, came hurtling through the air towards me. Heavens! How grand he looked, and how awful! High into the air he flew, describing a great arch. Just as he touched the highest point of his spring, I fired. I did not dare to wait, for I saw that he would clear the whole space and land right upon me. Without a sight, almost without aim, I fired, as one would fire a snapshot at a snipe. The bullet told, for I distinctly heard its thud above the rushing sound caused by the passage of the lion through the air. Next second, I was swept to the ground. Luckily, I fell into a low, creeper-clad bush which broke the shock, and the lion was on the top of me, and the next those great white teeth of his had met in my thigh. I heard them grate against the bone. I yelled out in agony, for I did not feel in the least benumbed and happy like Dr. Livingstone, whom, by the way, I knew very well, and gave myself up for dead. But suddenly, at that moment, the lion's grip on my thigh loosened, and he stood over me, swaying to and fro, his huge mouth, from which the blood was gushing, wide opened. Then he roared, and the sound shook the rocks. To and fro he swung, and then the great head dropped on me, knocking all the breath from my body, and he was dead. My bullet had entered in the center of his chest and passed out on the right side of the spine about halfway down the back. The pain of my wound kept me from fainting, and as soon as I got my breath, I managed to drag myself from under him. Thank heavens, his great teeth had not crushed my thigh bone, but I was losing a great deal of blood, and had it not been for the timely arrival of Tom, with whose aid I loosed the handkerchief from my wrist and tied it round my leg, twisting it tight with a stick, I think that I should have bled to death. Well, it was a just reward for my folly in trying to tackle a family of lions single-handed. The odds were too long. I have been lame ever since and shall be to my dying day. In the month of March the wound always troubles me a great deal, and every 3 years it breaks out raw. I need scarcely add that I never traded the lot of ivory at Sikukuni's. Another man got it, a German, and made £500 out of it after paying expenses. I spent the next month on the broad of my back and was a cripple for 6 months after that, and now I've told you the yarn, so I will have a drop of Hollands and go to bed. Good night to you all, good night.